So if you read anything about Augustine, first of all, it's very complicated because he wrote like 70 different books, and his views changed all. Hard to pin him down. But the one thing Augustine was, if you read secular historians writing about Augustine, they call him a Neoplatonist. He loved everything Greek. And so he played what I call the shell game, where you put a marble or a nut underneath a shell and you move them all around, and then you try to find. That's what he did with Christian terminology. So he took Greek ideas and he applied Christian terminology for it, theological terminology for it, and we ended up that was the beginning of the church being totally Hellenized. So for example, show me anywhere in Scripture where you can find omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. It's not there. Nowhere in the Old Testament do you use these terminologies. Let me backtrack just a little bit. Okay, the Greeks early on in ancient Greece, they were observers of nature, and they would see, okay, the sun moves in a certain way. Every year we have autumn, goes into winter, and then spring, and then summer. And they saw how the world worked in a non-chaotic way. It was orderly. And they said to themselves, well, if there's this kind of order, there must be something in back of that, a God, as it were. So they said, well, if there is a God, what would this God be like? And they said, well, first of all, when we think of God, we must think of absolute perfection. Right? God has to be perfect in every way, or he can't be God. So by definition, perfection, absolute perfection, and God were the same thing. Okay, sounds good. But here's the problem. Then you start working your way down. Well, if God is perfect, then he can never change, right? Never change. So if you're perfect, you can't change. If you change, then you're not perfect. So you just have to act at this level. You're perfect, and there's no change allowed at all. Secondly, you've got to be all-knowing. You have to know everything. Past, present, future, we call it the all-present now. You know everything at one time. Okay? Also, they said, well, he also has to be everywhere. Everywhere present. Present in everything. That's part of the aspect of God. And then they said, well, he's also got to be all-knowing and all-powerful. So everything that happens is the will of God. That's Greek thinking. Now, if you read the Old Testament, that's not God. Not God. You only make it into, Genesis chapter 8, and God says, he looked around and there was only evil in the world, right? And it said, God repented that he ever made man. Look it up. I didn't make that up. I make some of it. That's not it. God repented that he made man. Well, if God knew, and it was God's will, because it happened, if God's will was being implemented by sin and by rebellion and by evil, then he should have been happy, right? Because his will was being done. But he wasn't. He was distraught. He was he said he repented. He was sorry he ever made man. Now, that brings up, is God the author of his own suffering? Then it's his fault, not ours, right? It wasn't us, it was him. He planned it all out, was happy when we rebelled against him. No. Also, in the Old Testament, almost when God is interacting with man, he propositions man, right? He said, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, then what happens? Then they'll hear from heaven. Okay? Propositioning man. You do this, I'll do that. Moses stands in front of his people and says, I set before you this day blessing or cursing. life or death. What are you going to choose? Which way you going? Now, that's not God up there manipulating, pulling on. God created what we refer to as free moral agents. Man, women, humans. Free moral agents that he propositions that hopefully that you will respond in a proper way. And oh, by the way, if there is no opportunity to not love, then love means nothing. In other words, if we are a bunch of robots, and I think somebody, last week, did you use the word robot yesterday, I think, yeah. If we're just a bunch of robots down here, waiting, being manipulated like puppets by God, and then God says, well, I'm a little lonely today, I think I need a little love, So he hits a button, and we all said, yes, God, we love you. That's not relationship. That's not God. But when it's like, again, my grandpa thing. If I'm sitting in my easy chair, I don't really have one, but if I had one, and I sat in it, and my little granddaughter, comes up, and I'm reading the paper, and she crawls on my lap and crawls under my newspaper, I'm not going to get mad at her and say, go away, kid. No, and she puts her arms around me and says, Grampy, I love you. Whoa! Now that is that's the real deal. That's the real sense of being loved. Not because she had to, or because she robotically pushed the button. When she did it of her own accord, then it's valuable. And so we have to I think we have to rethink a little. Oh, by the way, here's the other thing that happened. So Augustine comes along. The church is Hellenized. The church is now, there's a hierarchy of the church now, right? We have a pope eventually, starting out in the Western world. We have a pope, and then we have this great power hierarchy that works its way down, and it becomes absolute, totally corrupt, unbelievably corrupt. By about the 1400s or so, along there, the Borgia family out of Spain became the popes. And under Pope Alexander I, interesting terminology, right? Not a saint, but Alexander, like Alexander the Great. Get the picture? Well, it was said that there was not a brothel in all of Rome that was nearly as corrupt as the Vatican. Alexander, he was the most corrupt pope, and it was just decadent. Now, here's what happens in hierarchies. Whenever you create a hierarchy, do you understand what a hierarchy is? It's kind of a system of power and structure used to kind of control or organize or manipulate. Hierarchies always go corrupt at the top and disenfranchising at the bottom. They don't let people in, or they're rejecting people at the bottom, and at the top, they're corrupt. Always, every hierarchy goes up, and the church went that way, the Catholic Church. However, there was a chance, remember during the Renaissance? The Renaissance? What happened during the Renaissance? The Reformation. Mm-hmm. Wow, the Reformation, that's cool, that really changed things, right? No. Guess we talked about yesterday. Renaissance was the rebirth of what? Greek thinking. Where was John Calvin? 1520, right in the middle of the University of Paris and other universities in France, right in the middle of the Renaissance, which is the rebirth of Greek thinking. So read John Calvin. The predestination. God is, I read one, and actually I sat down to try to read John Calvin's Institutes of the Church. If you get a chance to do it, don't. That's tough. It's tough going. But when, again, it didn't dawn on me for a while, but I was reading Calvin, and I'm going, wow, that sounds so familiar. I couldn't, it took me a while. My two little brain cells didn't connect for a while. And after a while, I thought, aha, I know where it is. It was Thomas of Aquinas. Mm-hmm. Because Calvin basically took everything he got from Thomas of Aquinas. Guess who was the disciple of Augustine? Thomas of Aquinas. So the Reformation didn't go anywhere. It didn't. It just brought a bunch of new splits into the church, but it didn't solve anything. If you get into, as a matter of fact, hyper-Calvinism and Islam are almost identical. Total depravity, God, God existing in a closed system. Everything that happens is God's will, and on and on and on. And so we haven't gone very far. So when a lot of times people like Stephen Fry take on the God, that's not the God of Christianity. That's not the God of Judaism. That's a Greek God that he's concerned about. Not the God that we know and love in the sense of coming out of Judaic tradition. And so, does God know everything? Did Jesus know everything? Well, somebody asked him, well, when is the end times? He goes, I don't know. Only the Father knows that one. And, there's any number of things, but I think it makes a lot more sense to me anyway, that God works with man. He propositions us. He says, if you do this, I can do this. I think that's why prayer, and if God is existing in what we call a closed system, where he can have no new thoughts, he can have no knowledge, no new knowledge, he already knows everything. He's already, and decided what everything is going to happen. And if he's in that closed system, then we are a bunch of just robots, and our choices are not very valid. They've already been predetermined. And so life becomes pretty flat. However, if God is living in an open system, and I got you right there, that's the big thing. If God is living in an open system, and he's tracking with man, and he said, man, I'm looking for somebody that will stand in the gap here. I don't want to bring judgment in this situation. I need somebody that'll be an intercessor, so I don't have to do it. Now, does that sound like a God who's already got everything predestined and going, that's good, that's good? No, God's going to help me, somebody. Come on. Who's going to step up? Isaiah, drop to your knees, buddy. I need some help here. So, that makes a lot more sense to me. Now, I'm not saying I'm not even saying that it's absolutely right. It might be mostly right, but it's something to think about. Okay? Think about it. Don't have to believe everything. Now then.
If God is waiting on us to do certain things, does that take away a portion of his power over us?
Yes.
And over situations?
Absolutely.
So that would mean that God is not then all powerful.
Right.
Huh? What?
Could God possibly choose to limit himself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that possible?
But that still means that the fact that he would have the power to limit himself still gives him all power.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me ask you, what do you mean by all power?
Just in control of every aspect of everything.
Yeah.
Rather he chooses to use it or not.
Is that a good thing?
I would assume so, because he's perfect.
Oh, he is. He can't change?
But he still has, he's always going to have perfect intentions.
But does God's will always get done?
No, because of free will.
There we go.
But
Back to the age-old discussion. Yes, Jephthah.
That, if he's perfect, it doesn't mean that everything goes along with his will, right?
But
He can be perfect, he can be all-knowing and all-powerful and all-present, but it doesn't mean that everything that happens because of his will. Because there's sin and there's brokenness. I would say.
I'm not sure. That's a good question. It's hard to argue both ways in the sense that if God's all powerful, all knowing, all this, and he's existing in this closed system, in my opinion, it becomes harder to explain then, how do you reconcile that with then the free agency of man? Man's free will to choose, because he may not, unless God, again, limits himself and says, well, I could if I wanted to, but I'm letting this go. I've got another idea I'll share in just a minute, but that might help, that may not.